Now, he's a leading security specialist here to shine a light on who the modern cyber criminal is. Joining us via Skype from the UK is Global Head of Security Research at Sophos, James Line. James, thanks and welcome to the summit.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Now, let's start with the headline there. Who is the modern cyber criminal, and how have cyber criminals changed maybe over the years?
Well, as my eloquent prior speaker, Peter W. Singer, was saying, there is, of course, that wonderful stereotype of the hooded person sitting in their basement, tapping away, writing malicious code. But the reality today couldn't be further from the truth. I have been reverse engineering and playing with malicious code now for about 12 years, day in, day out. And I have been staggered by the utter professionalism of these cyber criminals, how they coordinate, work with each other, and the staggering tools that they develop to make it point and click easy to compromise people's networks. I guess a couple of the best examples of that. I remember 4 years ago finding a toolkit which was being distributed in a couple of cybercrime forums, being sold for about $700 US, which came with a setup guide, a nice video that told you how to set up your illegal hacking system.
Wow.
And which packaged up several very nasty exploits to make it trivial to distribute malware to users, so that you didn't really require any technical expertise at all. And from that point forwards, it's really only built to be, I believe, the economic definition of an illicit market. Today, we have over 50 different competing cybercrime products produced by cybercriminals and sold to cybercriminals to be used for these hacking purposes. I think that the most recent interesting innovation is actually how they're making money from our data and how they're learning to diversify their business interests. And I use that word business very selectively here. I look at some of the more recent cybercrime markets where you have actual websites dedicated to allowing cybercriminals to sell on the information that they've stolen. One of them in particular that we recently infiltrated, I have to admit they actually have slightly better security practices than the average retail organization, where you can simply point and click, select credit cards that have been stolen in the last 2 days, and put a price on them to acquire them, only seconds later receiving a nice little Excel file containing all the information that you can use for fraud purposes. So we absolutely have to consider the modern cyber criminal not as, you know, the geeky teenager doing it for attention.
Yeah.
There are some of those, but as a professional that is interested in making money from your data, and with professional software receiving software updates to get that job done.
Wow. So, that's, of course, debunking some of the physical perceptions of who these are, running around in hoodies. But what other myths exist about cyber criminals?
Well, I guess there are two things here. Firstly, I think it's a myth that exists in IT security. You'll hear it in any frustrated IT room, which is our users never listen to us. You know, we tell them not to click on these things and they always do it.
Yeah.
And I'd like to slay that myth, because if you walk to any user in the average business, or even if you walk down the street and you ask someone what constitutes a good password, they will replay the exact advice that us security professionals would have given them 6-7 years ago, as if it's, word for word copied from the security policy. I'd actually argue that many people, once they hold on to a security idea, will hold on to it for years to come, and will have to pry it from their cold dead fingers. In many cases, that leads to a scenario where cyber criminals are able to take advantage of very basic flaws in user behavior, or very basic flaws in our networks. And this leads us to the biggest myth. You will look at headlines day to day, you'll look at these terrifying stories of mass data breaches. You'll read things like the uber unblockable virus that no one can stop, and how this advanced attack compromised this network and there's nothing they could have done, only to find out that it really came down to some very, very simple failures using very simple techniques to compromise that network. The majority of cybercrime really doesn't use high-end attacks. but simple techniques that are still effective due to gaps in user education or simple operational security practices. Now, there's another interesting illusion here as well about cyber criminals, which I think is worth bringing up. It's the they're not interested in me.
Hmm.
And I've heard that been recounted so many
Sure.
times over the
It's
years.
probably very common,
Um,
right?
it's incredibly common, absolutely. I mean, every other data breach, like, well, why did they focus on me? I mean,
Right.
I'm only a small business or I'm an individual. A really nasty case I dealt with just last week, where an individual in dealing with a transaction to buy a house was conned into giving away a large amount of money because their email account was hacked and alternative banking details provided. That person, first question, why me? I mean, there are so many other people I could target. We have to accept that the majority of cybercrime is opportunistic. It's about land grabbing access to as many systems as possible. And many cybercriminal campaigns operate on a spray and pray basis.
Hmm.
It's about getting phishing emails into as many inboxes as possible, compromising as many web browsers to get as much malicious code running around the world as they can, and then figuring out ways to profit. I think one of the really interesting trends that's now starting to appear is cyber criminals opportunistically attacking anyone, doesn't matter if you're interesting or not, and then retrospectively looking at your data, deciding you might be a more valuable target, and moving to spend some time focusing on how they could profit from you the most.
Wow. Well, clearly, James, they come in all shapes and sizes, and they may be after, like you said, something as simple as our credit cards might be up for sale right now, and I wouldn't even know. But are there particular trends in cybercrime right now? Is there a particular trend that maybe is, for lack of a better term, popular in cybercrime right now?
I think there are two major areas I would draw attention to. The first is the more diverse ways that they're making money from us.
Right.
Now, I think it's pretty easy for us all to see how cybercriminals could make money from a stolen credit card, right? That makes sense. But things like ransomware have been prolific campaigns over the past 18, 24 months. For those of you that haven't run into it, malicious code that drops onto your computer encrypts your data with a password you don't have or a key you don't possess, and then demands money to decrypt it. It's been in the news a fair degree. It is amazing the number of different variations of that campaign that are now spinning up, and how over time they've matured their software to make that data harder to decrypt. So you as a user really are only in the position of being able to restore to a backup or paying them money. It's also been amazing seeing some of the high profile places like police departments, for example, that have actually admitted to paying that bill to get their data back.
Mm.
So that's certainly one of the areas that I would point to. And I'll be very intrigued to see how they evolve their profit making schemes beyond ransomware. The other one is an interesting diversification in the techniques that cybercriminals are using today. I mean, the last 5, 6 years of cybercrime have really been driven by exploiting users' web browsers. So typically, you receive a phishing email, you click on it, the web browser opens, and because you're not entirely up to date, or maybe because you click on something you shouldn't, you end up running malicious code. In many cases, these exploit packs, these crime packs that I mentioned earlier, were the driving force of that malicious code distribution. We saw in some cases in excess of 350,000 new pieces of malware being generated a day through those techniques. In the last 6 months, we've seen a little bit of kind of stratification of cyber criminals. We're seeing more and more use of social engineering techniques than we've ever seen before. So less reliance on technical attacks and more on trying to game the user. And that's a very concerning thing for me. I mentioned earlier the example of users kind of spouting back password theory from 6 or 7 years ago. If you go and ask the average user what a scam or a spam looks like, they'll tell you about the Nigerian banker that wants to give you $42 million because
I just got an email from
he's
him.
good.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, everyone always seems to be in touch with him, mate. It's
Yeah.
just bizarre. He really gets around. Um, Although I got a fantastic one the other day, which was actually just looking for anyone out there in the world that might be in possession of a time traveling device
Hmm.
to help them correct some serious, international incident that was about to occur. The amazing thing is, we have data that shows that some people actually replied to it.
Wow.
I would love to know who those people are, and I'm putting them in the category of can't be helped.
Yes. Fair enough.
But for the rest of us, um, there is this stereotype of the comically bad scam, terrible grammar, bad spelling, dodgy links,
Yeah.
weird images, which you'll find in most people's security policies. A lot of these new scams that I'm now seeing don't have those traits.
Mm.
We're seeing scams that, frankly, I think are a little more convincing than some of the real emails we receive. I did a comparison just tactically between a lot of the financial institutions' emails in the UK that I had received, what we call ham, so real emails, and the scams. And if you were to apply some of those traditional pieces of advice we give to users, there are many cases where you would choose the scam over the legitimate email. So that's an interesting new trend of cybercriminals relying on these outdated ideas that our users have about how they'll be attacked, the comically bad scam, and catching them off guard. And the most brutal example of that I've seen, which has been appearing in the past couple of months, is emails which profess to contain encrypted messages.
Hmm.
And of course, if it's encrypted, it's got to be important, right? It's got to contain sensitive data. You need to open it. And they're actually using security to convince our users to disable their security and
Aha.
execute this nasty malicious code, which is kind of brilliant and terrible at the same
Hmm.
time. Right? But I almost admire that one. So, really, something we as security professionals, we as business people, need to be on top of, and making sure that people are up to speed on the latest tactics that cyber criminals are using against
Hmm.
us.
Now, we've talked a little bit about what the modern cyber criminal looks like, which is a broad spectrum. You just never know. But what about the modern cyber criminal operation? Entertainment would have us believe that it might be the kid in the hoodie in his mom's basement, or it might be a group of really smart people using that old abandoned carnival on the boardwalk. But what does a modern cyber criminal operation actually look like? How sophisticated does it have to be? Is it brick and mortar, or is it everywhere?
Well, I'm not saying those two scenarios don't happen. And I think the truth of it is, given the tiny percentage of cyber criminals that we often get to catch and interrogate as a global community, it's very hard to say truly how those cyber criminals operate day to day. But you look at some of the small number of cases where we've got inside these gangs, and they often just look like small businesses. They've got a couple of developers working away, sometimes a one-man band. They often have a nice small office, often in the stereotype locations. Although I do love the idea of PW Singer's hacker migration to finer weather. I'll be very interested to see if I start seeing more scams moving from St. Petersburg to warmer climes in the next
Right.
little while. Um, but that aside, I mean, they often just look like typical small businesses. We've seen them, managing their source code, uploading them to servers. We've had cases where cyber criminals have made cyber criminal faux pas and allowed us to access their stuff and see what they're up to. I think the way to really think about them today is just as a standard SME, a standard small business, and a virtual organization. Um, I think the more interesting thing to focus on is the artifacts that they generate and how they target our users. I think we kind of need to move beyond trying to profile these people too much in terms of what their physical operations may look like,
Hmm.
as we can certainly see their virtual collaboration is significant. And from the way they're distributing product updates, we can certainly see they're coordinated. I think if any one example I would pick to really paint the picture of the professionalism of these modern operations, there are cyber criminal gangs that run quality assurance and testing services for malware. There are gangs who will literally allow another cyber criminal gang to upload their nasty code and will check it against all the security products up there, provide a scheduled report to tell them how good a job they're doing of bypassing the global security community so they can drive their software quality towards compromising
Wow.
more systems. It sounds like us, but just from
Yeah.
the opposite side.
So there's actually quality control in cybercrime. And you're saying that, if I'm understanding you correctly, that our idea of these groups hiding in a darkened subterranean compound or in that unmarked van out front, that might be one of the big myths. In fact, they may be hiding in plain sight, operating next door.
Absolutely, and I'm always asked, well, aren't all the cyber criminals in Russia, in China, in Korea, and so on? And granted, there have been cases of that where we know that is the case, but often what we see is infrastructure there, and there's nothing to say that it couldn't be someone 20 meters away from me, in the lovely English weather that is presently pouring down outside, who's actually controlling that. I mean, we have to remember the internet is borderless, and ostensibly these people could be doing it from anywhere.
Wow. Well, let's circle back to something we started with, which I think is very relatable, whether it's in business or even on the consumer level, is that many of us think, well, I'm not at risk because I'm just a small business, or I'm just me. They're not going to want to get into my financial information. How do cyber criminals select their targets?
So first and foremost, opportunistically, and if you have credit card information or banking details, which I'm pretty sure you do, you are interesting to them,
Hmm.
and you need to protect yourself. That being said, of course, there are cases where we see cyber criminal gangs focusing on certain parts of the supply chain. We've seen campaigns that were laser focused on organizations that provide payment card terminals to shops. We've seen campaigns where they've been focused on procuring specific intellectual property, to deal with certain commercial transactions in the petrochemical and oil industry. So that those high end attacks are absolutely out there, but the grand majority of it, let's say 99% with an asterisk that it's a made up percentage, are really interested in targeting anyone with information they can profit from.
Hmm.
I think one of the more alarming aspects of that is the mundane data that cybercriminals can profit from. If I revert back to one of the cybercriminal forums I mentioned earlier, Alpha Bay, if you go through there, there's the credit card section. It makes sense. But they have two other sections that are very interesting. First is a section that sells email accounts. And in there, you find email accounts, usernames, and passwords being sold for anywhere between about 30 cents and $2, depending on the nature of the account and whether it's verified. So even just access to your email account is something the cybercriminals can make money from. And if they do that thousands of times, you're worth attacking. That email
Wow.
account may be used to conduct fraud against your friends, family, colleagues. It may be used to launch attacks against other organizations to hijack reputation. One of the more prolific campaigns at the moment is to gain access to an email account, search your emails for any documents that mention the word invoice or payment or remittance, to reply back to the party and opportunistically provide alternative banking details and see who pays.
Right.
Think about how many times you've got an invoice note that's gone to a client. So your email account was hacked and they received a follow up asking for a change in bank details. Would they process it without querying? So cyber criminals can literally make money from some email usernames and passwords. To
And
take
for
that
as
even
for
further,
as little as
sorry.
$2, you said.
Yeah, and in some cases, even less.
Wow.
Around 30 cents has been the kind of lowest that we've seen on those marketplaces. But that scales up to some significant sums of money very quickly.
Yeah.
You have a cyber criminal there collecting those usernames and passwords, selling thousands of them, taking their money, and then sending that on to a group of other fraudsters who will spend a bit more time trying to conduct a higher value scam. We have a cyber criminal value chain forming here. Right? It's a supply and demand market, which I still, looking back at malware all those years ago, where people used to send us viruses they'd never release for fun and intellectual interest, find staggering. There's one other section in that market that I think is briefly worth noting. They sell credentials, access to people's networks.
Hmm.
So I was browsing through there the other day and I saw, organized by geography, organized by rough vertical. So, for example, state and healthcare, the sale of some credentials to remote access that network. You also see a pricing differential between whether they're a user, an administrator, and some rough estimation of pricing based on the size of company. Just selling access to your network for magnification of a distributed denial of service attack, for mining your data, for using it to launch a follow-on attack can make the cyber criminals money, and prices are as low as the email account up to, in some cases, $50, $60, where you have cyber criminals just selling this stuff off, not wanting to be involved in the more hardcore fraud aspects of the transaction. And I certainly found that fascinating. And I think many
Mhm.
people often don't get past the credit card and would find that interesting too.
Mhm. Now, I'm curious, are there ways to identify, again, whether it's at the corporate level or on a consumer level, if you're getting a lot of those emails that are very clearly phishing emails, does that mean that you've been targeted, or are we just all fair game now?
I think at this point we're pretty much fair game. I certainly think if you start getting targeted scenarios that mention you or your company or clone your logo, you've snared some particular interest. Um, that being said, there are campaigns out there that are fairly opportunistic, but they'll take time to scrape your website, look for the CFO, look for the CEO, and try and at least forge the identity of that person.
Right.
I think really at this point, the majority of attacks really are opportunistic. You're fair game, you are a target, and you should plan as such.
Now, are there any particular tools of the cybercrime trade? Of course, starts with a computer or mobile devices, but are there specific tools that cybercrime is relying upon?
Yeah, there are these crime packs that I mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
which are really the driving force of this industry, and a variety of different variations of them now. We're getting little sub markets developing, specializing in different areas of attack. I think the most amazing thing to me was seeing cyber criminals offering technical support packages, offering assistance to help you set up your hacking server. What One of the exploit packs, which is a bit of a market leader amongst that pack of 50 or so, actually not that long ago moved to offering a cloud service where you could just rent from them this control panel to launch your attacks. They manage all of the infrastructure, all of the installation. They even offered a money back guarantee if law enforcement were to take down your illegal hacking server. Um, I'm not really sure how you'd fare with, trying to push your consumer rights with a illicit cybercrime gang in law, but it's an interesting offer nonetheless. Now, those tools are creating a bit of homogenization. We're seeing the script kiddies, the amateurs, alongside the cyber criminals, alongside in some cases the more severe upmarket actors, using these same tools. And really, instead of separating these actors by technical techniques increasingly, we're separating them by their motives, as they're all centering around these tools,
Hmm.
which do provide some fairly fantastic usability to gain access to high-end attacks.
Cybercrime starter packs are out there. That's terrifying enough, James. But talk to us about, on our side of things, what are the biggest practical things businesses can do to improve their security today?
Well, I think we often have a tendency in the security industry to focus on the security 1%. To go after the high end, most scary attack, the most theoretically unblockable thing. I said it earlier and I stand by it. The majority of attacks take advantage of simple operational security failures, of simple user behaviors. And as a result, the things that will actually have the biggest impact for most businesses are simple. Ask yourself, if security is a good mix of people, process, and technology, do I really do a good job of educating my people on the do's and don'ts? You probably have a security policy for compliance reasons. If you read that security policy as an IT or a security person, is it so boring that you cannot stand to get through that document? Because I've read a lot of them and they're normally horrifyingly dull. Yet we expect our users to consume this stuff and apply it. It's filled with the thou shalt not and thou shalt not do
Hmm.
this. So, can you be more creative? I found video education can be far more effective. I found that rephrasing advice around targeting the individual, instead of saying, you need to do these things to protect the company, saying to keep your friends, family, and colleagues safe, to protect your credit card,
Right.
here are some things you should do. And they're often remarkably aligned to what a business would want from its users anyway. Um, Things like patching, still an incredibly effective defense against a lot of attacks.
Mhm.
I see so many breaches where the way in wasn't something new. It was something that was patched 2, 3, 4 weeks before, and it hasn't consistently been deployed to users. Um, and last but not least, a growing trend, have a look at how your security policies, the things you do today, how your controls extend to users on the road. I mean, it's an increasing default, but whenever I get called into a breach now, I'll find a security setup that is laser focused on the office and keeping strong walls around it. But as soon as you roam out to your favorite coffee shop, a far lower standard of security and monitoring is actually deployed. So I think taking a good hard look at those processes and those controls and making sure they're consistent really makes sense. And I could carry on ranting, but if you search for these things, you'll find the same top
Mhm.
10 from so many of the big voices in the industry. And really, it's getting those consistently deployed that matters.
James, in our last couple of minutes here, I do want to make sure I get back to our poll question because we've given our audience a chance to weigh in here online. That question again, if you need a refresher, do you feel your corporate security policies are adequate and up to date with the latest cybercriminal tactics? A, yes. B, no. C, don't know. And 73% say no. How do you react to that?
Well, that's depressing but honest. So I commend you, and I think it's also a healthy attitude. You know,
Sure.
we're dealing with coordinated, smart cyber criminals. We're dealing with a very challenging dynamic today of constantly roaming users, a wealth of new devices. You know, we haven't even stuck into things like the Internet of Things. And I think that's a very healthy attitude to have towards your security policies. So when you finish this particular session, not during it because we've got some good stuff coming up. um, go back and look at those policies, look at the latest best practice, and make sure that you're advising users on the latest things they should be doing, and that you believe you have those security basics under control.
Now, in our final minute, a big topic, but I just want to get your take. Internet of Things, of course, a huge trend today. How will IoT affect the cybersecurity conversation?
I thought you were mean for doing
Yeah.
IoT in a minute to our prior speaker, and you've done it to
I
me as
rephrased
well.
it as a moment, so that's open ended. Go ahead.
Oh, that's good. That's good. um, so, brevity be the soul of wit, as they say. It's a huge topic. We could spend a lot of time on it. I recently procured several $1,000s worth of Internet of Things devices for a research project. It was the most bizarre shopping cart of all time, from the wireless toothbrush to the plant watering device to CCTV, baby monitors, you name it. Several things in there I really don't understand why anyone would ever want. Regardless, we ripped them apart. We looked at how they communicate, the general level of quality of implementation. I can tell you that in many cases, these Internet of Things devices are taking us back 10, 15 years in quality of implementation. They found plain text usernames and passwords, terrible, terrible crypto, um, obvious opportunities for exploitation that have massively been eradicated from the more robust computing platforms we mostly use today. None of the mitigations that would make my life as a offensive security researcher hard. It's really, really immature. Now, so far, I think we're being protected by the fact that cyber criminals are less interested in these devices. Why? They don't contain as much PII. They don't have your credit card number. It makes more sense to go after, the traditional computer. That's going to change. If you look at the speed of innovation in this market, a mass use case will kick into touch, and all of a sudden we'll have millions of these devices deployed, and we're going to have a relatively immature standard of security in that device, which all of a sudden will become a target. And as security professionals, we're going to have to run around frantically. I don't want anyone to walk away from this thinking, I need to immediately be terrified about the security of my latest doll for my kids. Granted, it's horrible, but most cybercriminals don't care. Would you not, as an industry, rather not make sure we get this right whilst these things are still toys before they really form a part of the physical infrastructure that offers potential control of life and limb in our homes and in our offices? We have a chance to get this right. It's a small window and closing, and it's an area that desperately needs standards and attention.
James Line, all the way from the UK, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights with us today or tonight where you are. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.